Chapter 2, Part 1 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 2 At Sicca. 2 days afterwards the mercenaries left Carthage. They had each received a piece of gold on the condition that they should go into camp at Sicca, and they had been told with all sorts of caresses: "You are the saviours of Carthage, but you would starve it if you remained here. It would become insolvent. Withdraw. The Republic will be grateful to you later for all this condescension. We are going to levy taxes immediately, your pay shall be in full, and galleys shall be equipped to take you back to your native lands." They did not know how to reply to all this talk. These men, accustomed as they were to war, were wearied by residence in a town. There was difficulty in convincing them, and the people mounted the walls to see them go away. They defiled through the street of Khamon and the Cirta gate, pell-mell, archers with hoplites, captains with soldiers, Lusitanians with Greeks. They marched with a bold step, rattling their heavy cothurni on the paving stones. Their armour was dented by the catapult, and their faces blackened by the sunburn of battles. Hoarse cries issued from their thick beards, their tattered coats of mail flapped upon the pommels of their swords, and through the holes in the brass might be seen their naked limbs, as frightful as engines of war. Sarissæ, axes, spears, felt caps and bronze helmets all swung together with a single motion. They filled the street thickly enough to have made the walls crack, and the long mass of armed soldiers overflowed between the lofty, bitumen-smeared houses 6 stories high. Behind their gratings of iron or reed, the women, with veiled heads, silently watched the barbarians pass. The terraces, fortifications and walls were hidden beneath the crowd of Carthaginians, who were dressed in garments of black. The sailors' tunics showed like drops of blood among the dark multitude, and nearly naked children, whose skin shone beneath their copper bracelets, gesticulated in the foliage of the columns or amid the branches of a palm tree. Some of the ancients were posted on the platform of the towers, and people did not know why a personage with a long beard stood thus in a dreamy attitude here and there. He appeared in the distance against the background of the sky, vague as a phantom and motionless as stone. All, however, were oppressed with the same anxiety. It was feared that the barbarians, seeing themselves so strong, might take a fancy to stay. But they were leaving with so much good faith that the Carthaginians grew bold and mingled with the soldiers. They overwhelmed them with protestations and embraces. Some, with exaggerated politeness and audacious hypocrisy, even sought to induce them not to leave the city. They threw perfumes, flowers, and pieces of silver to them. They gave them amulets to avert sickness, but they had spit upon them 3 times to attract death, or had enclosed jackal's hair within them to put cowardice into their hearts. Aloud they invoked Melkarth's favour, and in a whisper his curse. Then came the mob of baggage, beasts of burden, and stragglers. The sick groaned on the backs of dromedaries, while others limped along leaning on broken pikes. The drunkards carried leathern bottles, and the greedy quarters of meat, cakes, fruits, butter wrapped in fig leaves, and snow in linen bags. Some were to be seen with parasols in their hands and parrots on their shoulders. They had mastiffs, gazelles, and panthers following behind them. Women of Libyan race, mounted on asses, inveighed against the negresses who had forsaken the lupanaria of Malacca for the soldiers. Many of them were suckling children suspended on their bosoms by leathern thongs. The mules were goaded out at the point of the sword, their backs bending beneath the load of tents, while there were numbers of saving men and water-carriers, emaciated, jaundiced with fever, and filthy with vermin, the scum of the Carthaginian populace, who had attached themselves to the barbarians. When they had passed, the gates were shut behind them, but the people did not descend from the walls. The army soon spread over the breadth of the isthmus. It parted into unequal masses. Then the lances appeared like tall blades of grass, and finally all was lost in a train of dust. Those of the soldiers who looked back towards Carthage could now only see its long walls with their vacant battlements cut out against the edge of the sky. Then the barbarians heard a great shout. They thought that some from among them, for they did not know their own number, had remained in the town, and were amusing themselves by pillaging a temple. They laughed a great deal at the idea of this, and then continued their journey. They were rejoiced to find themselves as in former days, marching all together in the open country, and some of the Greeks sang the old song of the Mamertines: "With my lance and sword I plough and reap, I am master of the house. The disarmed man falls at my feet, and calls me lord and great king." They shouted, they leaped, the merriest began to tell stories, the time of their miseries was past. As they arrived at Tunis, some of them remarked that a troop of Balearic slingers was missing. They were doubtless not far off, and no further heed was paid to them. Some went to lodge in the houses, others camped at the foot of the walls, and the townspeople came out to chat with the soldiers. During the whole night fires were seen burning on the horizon in the direction of Carthage, the light stretched like giant torches across the motionless lake. No one in the army could tell what festival was being celebrated. On the following day the barbarians passed through a region that was covered with cultivation. The domains of the patricians succeeded one another along the border of the route, channels of water flowed through woods of palm, there were long, green lines of olive trees, rose-coloured vapours floated in the gorges of the hills, while blue mountains reared themselves behind. A warm wind was blowing. Chameleons were crawling on the broad leaves of the cactus. The barbarians slackened their speed. They marched on in isolated detachments, or lagged behind one another at long intervals. They ate grapes along the margin of the vines. They lay on the grass and gazed with stupefaction upon the large, artificially twisted horns of the oxen, the sheep clothed with skins to protect their wool, the furrows crossing one another so as to form lozenges, and the ploughshares like ships' anchors, with the pomegranate trees that were watered with silphium. Such wealth of the soil and such inventions of wisdom dazzled them. In the evening they stretched themselves on the tents without unfolding them, and thought with regret of Hamilcar's feast as they fell asleep with their faces towards the stars. In the middle of the following day they halted on the bank of a river, amid clumps of rose bays. Then they quickly threw aside lances, bucklers, and belts. They bathed with shouts, and drew water in their helmets, while others drank lying flat on their stomachs, and all in the midst of the beasts of burden whose baggage was slipping from them. Spendius, who was seated on a dromedary stolen in Hamilcar's parks, perceived Matho at a distance, with his arm hanging against his breast, his head bare, and his face bent down, giving his mule drink, and watching the water flow. Spendius immediately ran through the crowd, calling him, "Master! Master!" Matho gave him but scant thanks for his blessings, but Spendius paid no heed to this, and began to march behind him, from time to time turning restless glances in the direction of Carthage. He was the son of a Greek rhetor and a Campanian prostitute. He had at first grown rich by dealing in women, then, ruined by a shipwreck, he had made war against the Romans with the herdsmen of Samnium. He had been taken and had escaped, he had been retaken and had worked in the carries, panted in the vapour baths, shrieked under torture, passed through the hands of many masters, and experienced every frenzy. At last, one day, in despair, he had flung himself into the sea from the top of a trireme where he was working at the oar. Some of Hamilcar's sailors had picked him up when at the point of death, and had brought him to the ergastulum of Megara at Carthage. But as fugitives were to be given back to the Romans, he had taken advantage of the confusion to fly with the soldiers. During the whole of the march he remained near Matho. He brought him food, assisted him to dismount, and spread a carpet in the evening beneath his head. Matho at last was touched by these attentions, and by degrees unlocked his lips. He had been born in the Gulf of Syrtis. His father had taken him on a pilgrimage to the temple of Ammon. Then he had hunted elephants in the forests of the Garamantes. Afterwards he had entered the service of Carthage. He had been appointed tetrarch at the capture of Drepanum. The Republic owned him 4 horses, 23 medimni of wheat, and a winter's pay. He feared the gods and wished to die in his native land. Spendius spoke to him of his travels and of the peoples and temples that he had visited. He knew many things. He could make sandals, boar spears and nets. He could tame wild beasts and could cook fish. Sometimes he would interrupt himself and utter a hoarse cry from the depths of his throat. Matho's mule would quicken his pace, and others would hasten after them. And then Spendius would begin again, though still torn with agony. This subsided at last on the evening of the 4th day. They were marching side by side to the right of the army on the side of a hill. Below them stretched the plain, lost in the vapours of the night. The lines of soldiers also were defiling below, making undulations in the shade. From time to time these passed over eminences lit up by the moon, then stars would tremble on the points of the pikes, the helmets would glimmer for an instant, all would disappear, and others would come on continually. Startled flocks bleated in the distance, and a something of infinite sweetness seemed to sink upon the earth. Spendius, with his head thrown back and his eyes half closed, inhaled the freshness of the wind with great sighs. He spread out his arms, moving his fingers that he might the better feel the caresses that streamed over his body. Hopes of vengeance came back to him and transported him. He pressed his hands upon his mouth to check his sobs, and half swooning with intoxication, let go the halter of his dromedary, which was proceeding with long, regular steps. Matho had relapsed into his former melancholy, his legs hung down to the ground, and the grass made a continuous rustling as it beat against his cothurni. The journey, however, spread itself out without ever coming to an end. At the extremity of a plain they would always reach a round-shaped plateau, then they would descend again into a valley, and the mountains which seemed to block up the horizon would, in proportion as they were approached, glide as it were from their positions. From time to time a river would appear amid the verdure of tamarisks, to lose itself at the turning of the hills. Sometimes a huge rock would tower aloft like the prow of a vessel or the pedestal of some vanished colossus. At regular intervals they met with little quadrangular temples which served as stations for the pilgrims who repaired to Sicca. They were closed like tombs. The Libyans struck great blows upon the doors to have them opened, but no one inside responded. Then the cultivation became more rare. They suddenly entered upon belts of sand bristling with thorny thickets. Flocks of sheep were browsing among the stones. A woman with a blue fleece about her waist was watching them. She fled screaming when she saw the soldiers' pikes among the rocks. They were marching through a kind of large passage bordered by two chains of reddish-coloured hillocks, when their nostrils were greeted with a nauseous odour, and they thought that they could see something extraordinary on the top of a carob tree. A lion's head reared itself above the leaves. They ran thither. It was a lion with his 4 limbs fastened to a cross like a criminal. His huge muzzle fell upon his breast, and his 2 forepaws, half hidden beneath the abundance of his mane, were spread out wide like the wings of a bird. His ribs stood severally out beneath his distended skin. His hind legs, which were nailed against each other, were raised somewhat, and the black blood, flowing through his hair, had collected in stalactites at the end of his tail, which hung down perfectly straight along the cross. The soldiers made merry around, they called him consul and Roman citizen, and threw pebbles into his eyes to drive away the gnats. But 100 paces further on they saw 2 more, and then there suddenly appeared a long file of cross-bearing lions. Some had been so long dead that nothing was left against the wood but the remains of their skeletons. Others, which were half eaten away, had their jaws twisted into horrible grimaces. There were some enormous ones, the shafts of the crosses bent beneath them, and they swayed in the wind, while bands of crows wheeled ceaselessly in the air above their heads. It was thus that the Carthaginian peasants avenged themselves when they captured a wild beast. They hoped to terrify the others by such an example. The barbarians ceased their laughter and were lost in amazement. What people is this, they thought, that amuses itself by crucifying lions? They were, besides, especially the men of the north, vaguely uneasy, troubled, and already sick. They tore their hands with the darts of the aloes, great mosquitoes buzzed in their ears, and dysentery was breaking out in the army. They were weary and not yet seeing Sicca. They were afraid of losing themselves and of reaching the desert, the country of sands and terrors. Many even were unwilling to advance further. Others started back to Carthage. At last, on the seventh day, after following the base of a mountain for a long time, they turned abruptly to the right, and there then appeared a line of walls resting on white rocks and blending with them. Suddenly the entire city rose. Blue, yellow and white veils moved on the walls in the redness of the evening. These were the priestesses of Tanith, who had hastened hither to receive the men. They stood ranged along the rampart, striking tambourines, playing lyres and shaking crotala, while the rays of the sun, setting behind them in the mountains of Numidia, shot between the strings of their lyres, over which their naked arms were stretched. At intervals their instruments would become suddenly still, and a cry would break forth strident, precipitate, frenzied, continuous, a sort of barking which they made by striking both corners of the mouth with the tongue. Others, more motionless than the Sphinx, rested on their elbows with their chins on their hands, and darted their great black eyes upon the army as it ascended. Although Sicca was a sacred town, it could not hold such a multitude. The temple alone, with its appurtenances, occupied half of it. Accordingly, the barbarians established themselves at their ease on the plain, those who were disciplined in regular troops, and the rest according to nationality or their own fancy. The Greeks ranged their tents of skin in parallel lines, the Iberians placed their canvas pavilions in a circle, the Gauls made themselves huts of planks, the Libyans cabins of dry stones, while the Negroes with their nails hollowed out trenches in the sand to sleep in. Many, not knowing where to go, wandered about among the baggage, and at nightfall lay down in their ragged mantles on the ground. The plain, which was wholly bounded by mountains, expanded around them. Here and there a palm tree leaned over a sand hill, and pines and oaks flecked the sides of the precipices. Sometimes the rain of a storm would hang from the sky like a long scarf, while the country everywhere was still covered with azure and serenity. Then a warm wind would drive before it tornadoes of dust, and a stream would descend in cascades from the heights of Sicca, where, with its roofing of gold on its columns of brass, rose the temple of the Carthaginian Venus, the mistress of the land. She seemed to fill it with her soul. In such convulsions of the soil, such alternations of temperature, and such plays of light would she manifest the extravagance of her might with the beauty of her eternal smile. The mountains at their summits were crescent-shaped, others were like women's bosoms presenting their swelling breasts, and the barbarians felt a heaviness that was full of delight weighing down their fatigues. Spendius had bought a slave with the money brought him by his dromedary. The whole day long he lay asleep stretched before Matho's tent. Often he would awake, thinking in his dream that he heard the whistling of the thongs. With a smile he would pass his hands over the scars on his legs at the place where the fetters had long been worn, and then he would fall asleep again. Matho accepted his companionship, and when he went out Spendius would escort him like a lictor with a long sword on his thigh, or perhaps Matho would rest his arm carelessly on the other's shoulder, for Spendius was small. One evening when they were passing together through the streets in the camp, they perceived some men covered with white cloaks. Among them was Narr' the prince of the Numidians. Matho started. "Your sword!" he cried. "I will kill him." "Not yet," said Spendius, restraining him. Narr' was already advancing towards him. He kissed both thumbs in token of alliance, showing nothing of the anger which he had experienced at the drunkenness of the feast. Then he spoke at length against Carthage, but did not say what brought him among the barbarians. Was it to betray them or else the Republic? Spendius asked himself, and as he expected to profit by every disorder, he felt grateful to Narr' for the future perfidies of which he suspected him. The chief of the Numidians remained among the mercenaries. He appeared desirous of attaching Matho to himself. He sent him fat goats, gold dust, and ostrich feathers. The Libyan, who was amazed at such caresses, was in doubt whether to respond to them or to become exasperated at them. But Spendius pacified him, and Matho allowed himself to be ruled by the slave, remaining ever irresolute and in an unconquerable torpor, like those who have once taken a draught of which they are to die. One morning, when all three went out lion hunting, Narr' concealed a dagger in his cloak. Spendius kept continually behind him, and when they returned the dagger had not been drawn. Another time Narr' took them a long way off, as far as the boundaries of his kingdom. They came to a narrow gorge, and Narr' smiled as he declared that he had forgotten the way. Spendius found it again. But most frequently Matho would go off at sunrise, as melancholy as an augur, and wander about the country. He would stretch himself on the sand and remain there motionless until the evening. He consulted all the soothsayers in the army one after the other, those who watch the trail of serpents, those who read the stars, and those who breathe upon the ashes of the dead. He swallowed galbanum, seseli, and viper's venom which freezes the heart. Negro women, singing barbarous words in the moonlight, pricked at the skin of his forehead with golden stylets. He loaded himself with necklaces and charms. He invoked in turn Baal Khamun, Moloch, the seven Kabiri, Tanith, and the Venus of the Greeks. He engraved a name upon a copper plate and buried it in the sand at the threshold of his tent. Spendius used to hear him groaning and talking to himself. One night he went in. End of chapter 2, part 1.